Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The Final Fight for Freedom: How to Save Our Country from Chaos and War by Congressman Chris Stewart and Dane Stewart. Read by Tom Parks. A note from the authors. A few notes on the content and structure of this book. First, the threats outlined here are both realistic and imminent. They spring from our own internal chaos, the growing hatred and distrust of each other, the technological threats we face, some of which didn't exist even a few years ago, and the malicious intentions of foreign actors. We lay out these threats as clearly as we can. Everything written here is based on open-source U.S. and foreign intelligence, trends in recent history, public reporting, and the actions of real people. The technologies, tactics, threats, information, and foreign efforts against this nation are as accurate as we can portray them without revealing highly sensitive or classified information. Second, though this is a book of nonfiction, very often ideas can best be illustrated through fictionalized first-person accounts and personal points of view. You will see these types of narratives throughout this work, all of which are based on real-world events. Hopefully, these first-person accounts make the arguments both more interesting and powerful. The theme of this book is this: 2 wars are coming. The first will be internal. Indeed, we are forming the battle lines for that war now. Then, once we have weakened ourselves to the point of fracturing our nation, our enemies will pounce, bringing a catastrophic technological storm upon a weakened nation. Everything is on the line now. Prologue, Washington, D.C., December, near future. The situation certainly was a bitter irony, if nothing else. Darren Hardy had spent the better part of a decade vehemently opposing the private ownership of handguns and vilifying anyone who thought differently. Now, surrounded by the dead and dying, the violence and fear, he would literally give his left arm for a Glock and a dozen rounds. Like most of his media colleagues, he'd spent much of his time over the past few years dieting to cut the fat from his body and carving his physique to meet the high standards required of his profession. Now, he hadn't had a single scrap to eat in 2 days, and just a few meager meals in the past week. He'd kill for a bowl of rice. At least, he thought he would. He hadn't yet had a chance to test the proposition, but he knew that time was coming. As the nation's most recognizable television journalist, Darren Hardy had spent his career warning about global warming and the coming extinction. Socially conscious, he'd played his part in getting people to accept the proposition that they were facing an environmental disaster, one with inevitable and monumental consequences. He'd always wondered what that extinction-level event would be like. Now he knew, but he never guessed it would have come from this. "Do we have anything to eat today, Daddy?" Darren looked up to see his daughter emerge from her bedroom and plod down the stairs. Dark-haired and dark-eyed, she had always been all smiles and energy and giggles. But over the past few weeks, her body had taken on a painfully different appearance. Her face was hollow now, gaunt and angular, her eyes deep in their sockets, her mouth stretched across her jaw. She was feeling a little better, but the hunger and stomach pain had wreaked havoc on her small frame, stretching her thin, so much so that he hardly recognized her. He knew she was starving. "Not yet," he told her. "Soon, I promise." She frowned briefly, then sat down on the bottom stair and leaned her head against the wall. "Let's get you warm," Darren whispered as he laid a blanket across her shoulders. He knew she was confused and terrified, and she desperately missed her mom. She used to ask him why. What had happened? How long were they going to stay locked behind their front door? As their hunger grew, she started telling him they should leave, get out of the house, see what was out there. He had tried to reassure her, telling her things about FEMA and the police and the National Guard, telling her things about the government and how they would certainly send people who would help them, that everything would be better soon, and that they just needed a little bit of faith in the system. But he knew she didn't believe him any longer. He could tell she also knew that she was dying, and that her dad was too afraid to leave the house. She stared at him for several long seconds, then closed her eyes and seemed to drift away. He wasn't sure if she was sleeping. It seemed like that was all she did now, sleep and ask for food. He'd give anything if they could all go back to how life used to be, back to the time when he could feed his own child. His heart would have broken a little more if it were capable of such a thing, but he'd been through too much, seen too much violence, endured too much horror in recent weeks to suffer any more heartbreak. Darren's feelings had narrowed down now to only two things: hunger and shame. Being a typical American, sheltered and naive, he'd failed miserably to protect his family. His thoughts drifted to Irene, the mother of his child, and a familiar ache returned to his throat. She had been so good, an honest-to-goodness angel, and though they had separated, he had always loved her, just not as much, it turned out, as he had loved his work. But now she was gone, because he couldn't take care of his family. Darren shook his head and blinked away the tears. Tears wouldn't help him now. Neither would his phony friends at the FBI, and they certainly wouldn't help his daughter. He had to focus on how he was going to keep her alive. He stood and moved to the window. He felt a cool draft and smelled the smoke in the air from random fires and the few wood-burning fireplaces that still worked in some of the old homes that filled this part of the city. He pulled the blinds back and looked through the shattered pane. Despair settled around him like the ash that had settled on the city. Over the past 12 months, Darren had watched as the United States of America had committed suicide. How did it happen? It had started with another tight and outrageously emotional election, then quickly descended from there. A frozen Congress impotent to fix it, a Supreme Court too terrified to step into the political mess, an incompetent president trying to govern a nation where more than half the states had rejected his authority. Then stepped in the shadow government, those deeply entrenched bureaucrats who actually made the government work, but they simply were not up to it either. Everything started to fail. First came a wave of rising prices that, over the course of a year, mounted to a level of inflation that had never been seen before. Then came crushing job reports. More and more money created out of thin air. Shortages, spiking interest rates, waiting in line for gas, jokes about the U.S. becoming Venezuela. But behind the acid humor was real fear. Thinking the time of crisis was the time to go big, as if the years before had not been big enough, the president enacted an agenda that was beyond radical. Throughout it all, Darren and the rest of the supporting media had done a remarkable job of manipulating the minds of the people. Teaming with big tech and using suppression technologies made available by none other than the Chinese Communist Party, they eliminated any voice not consistent with their own values and program, destroying any who tried to resist. But it could not hold. They went too far. They went too fast. The people were not ready for the crisis or the controls. Too many of them were terrified. Too many of them were angry. Too many of them were armed. Riots and violence intensified with each new disaster, making the summer of 2020 look like a party in the streets. Then came the failure of the banking system. At least that's what they had said it was. Some thought it was something else, some kind of cyber attack upon the financial system from overseas. Either way, in an instant, more than half of the nation's bank accounts disappeared into the electronic void. More riots, growing violence. From coast to coast, fires burned in all the major cities. When the violence expanded to the rural states and small towns, many members of the incompetent Congress, paralyzed and unable to pass any meaningful legislation other than to spend more money, which at this point was fairly pointless, abandoned their efforts and went home to protect their families from the growing chaos. Seeing federal leadership abandon their own people, the nation seemed to explode. More riots, more rage, unfathomable hunger, states threatening to secede, some of them actually leaving, though the legality of that was as contested as the election. The National Guard was called out, but to little avail. The situation simply overwhelmed them. Everyone soon learned that when people are scared and hungry, the rules suddenly change. The loss of faith and compassion made them vicious. Another event, this one based in Russia, or perhaps it was China, or North Korea, who really knew, but wherever it began, someone introduced a deadly virus that quickly spread. At that point, most of the police refused to report to work. They had their own families to find a way to feed and protect. With the nation already on its knees, the final blow was served when most of the electrical grid went down. Some said the Chinese were responsible, but again, no one really knew. Regardless, the chaos was complete. No food, no medicine, no gas, starvation from coast to coast. Hospitals were overrun. The president finally ordered the army to the streets, a move that was as efficacious as slapping a bandage on a patient with stage 4 cancer. Besides, it turned out no one had ever suggested that it might be a good idea for the nation to store some food, not even enough to feed its own army. So most of the soldiers spent more time looting than protecting anyone around them, some of them even turning their weapons upon their fellow citizens. In less than a year, the nation was in ruin. The survivors left fighting for dirty coats and scraps of food. All that remained was truly brutal violence. That was the thing that really shocked him, how quickly and completely it took hold. Ammunition became the only currency that mattered, guns more valuable than gold. Yeah, looking back at the beginning, Darren realized he might have added a little to the anger and uncertainty. Sure, he had been a critic of the country. He'd preached against whiteness, railed against the capitalistic system, the economic injustice, the plight of the undocumented workers, the opposing party in D.C. And yeah, he had occasionally complained with a voice that had been a bit shrill. But he hadn't intended this. He certainly wasn't in any way responsible. Not him. He was a man of peace. It had been the others, the mob, who'd done what 200 years of foreign enemies had not been able to do: bring the greatest nation the world had ever seen to its knees. No, he and his progressive colleagues had meant well. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He looked out on the city. D.C. was barely a city anymore, torn apart by the riots, violence, and the rage of starving mobs. Rubble and ruin were everywhere. It was practically a ghost town. No, not a ghost town. Something worse. In a ghost town, all you had to worry about were the ghosts. There were many more things to worry about now. Another draft blew through the broken window. He smelled the rank odor of smoke and excrement and dead bodies. He didn't think he'd ever get used to the stench of rot and decay. But at that moment, it wasn't the appearance or smell of his new world that bothered him most. It wasn't the sound of gunfire in the distance, nor the smoke and orange glow that revealed that somewhere in the distance the city was on fire again. No, it was the setting sun that terrified him most, for then would come the darkness. He felt a chill run down his spine. Darren had spent his life laboring under the assumption that people weren't animals, that most people were compassionate and willing to lend a hand. Utter nonsense. He knew that now. Civilization was the only thing that had kept the worst of human nature in check, and it had proven to be no more solid than a wafer-thin sheet of ice, cracking in an instant and letting them all fall. Which is why, like his ancient ancestors, he had relearned to fear the dark. In these moments, when he was honest with himself, he would admit that the fear was what had kept him from leaving the city. That and the irrational hope that help was on its way. His daughter made a soft sound, and he turned and looked at her thin frame. She was having another bad dream, sitting there, her head against the wall at the bottom of the stairs. He knew if they were going to live, he had to make a decision. He took a deep breath and reviewed his options, which were precious few and equally terrible. He heard that one of his colleagues had sold his wife to one of the gangs, but he knew he'd never do anything like that. He'd never sell his daughter. He still understood that some things were worse than death. He could steal, but he didn't have any weapons, and he was not a strong man. He had no training or experience to make him believe he could ever win a physical confrontation with most of the people left on the streets. The weaker ones were already gone. But if he planned it right, there was a chance, although a small one, that he could steal a meal or two for himself and his daughter. But even if he were successful, he'd only get enough food to last them a few days. And if he was unsuccessful, then he'd be dead, and his daughter would be alone. The last option? He could start walking. It was exactly what his daughter had been pushing him to do, but fear had held him back. Fear of leaving his house. Fear of what he'd find. Fear of what the world had become. He'd heard the crazy rumors. Baltimore was just as bad. Philadelphia was worse. Rumors that the Black Plague had come back. The Russians were occupying some of the cities. The stench of death and anarchy everywhere. But glancing at his daughter, the only family he had left, he knew that whatever was out there couldn't possibly be worse than their present fate. He had waited long enough, perhaps too long. He didn't know how far he'd make it, especially if, in his weakened state, he had to carry his little girl. But he knew if they stayed, they were going to die here, hungry and alone. Without another thought, he drank what was left of the water he had stored, grabbed what few supplies he had, picked up his sleeping daughter, stepped out the front door, and started walking. Like millions of others in his country, Darren Hardy was now an American refugee. Book 1. National Suicide. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time, or die by suicide. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln understood the only real threat our nation has ever faced, the only thing that could actually destroy us, was the reality that we might destroy ourselves. And that hasn't changed over time. What he said was true when he said it, and it's still true today. The United States of America is the wealthiest, most generous, energetic, creative, and powerful nation on earth. We have the strongest military the world has ever seen, and our adversaries know this. No other nation can destroy us, but we can destroy ourselves. Like many great nations that have come and gone before us, including some even in our time, we can commit national suicide. Indeed, it is apparent that we are deep into the process of doing that. We know, that sounds crazy. The suicide of our nation. Not here, not now, not after all that we've been through, not after all that we've accomplished. We are the United freaking States. No way that's going to happen. Until it does. Because if we don't change our present trajectory, it's not just a possibility, it's a nearly inevitable fact. But could it really come to what we just described? Americans dying on the streets, the federal government collapsing, local governments proving incapable of providing any services, police protection disappearing like fog in the dark night, a financial collapse. Then, seeing our nation falter, our enemies attack with cyber warfare or a bio-attack. Could any one of us actually become an American refugee? Is it realistic to think that things could spiral out of control to the point that we, citizens of the greatest nation on earth, could be incapable of defending ourselves? Surely that couldn't happen. A friend in Israel once told us a phrase that we have often thought about. Just because something's never happened doesn't mean it never will. The citizens of Israel may say this because they understand, far better than any other nation, that it's better to consider the impossible possibility, the idea that seems preposterous, the thing that only crazy people have considered, than to find yourself unprepared. Okay, some may say, so maybe it could happen, hypothetically. Not that it will, but sure, maybe someday, when our grandchildren or maybe their children are old. But it couldn't happen now. We are generations away from such a horrible event. But the fact is, no, it won't take years to get to the tipping point. We are at the tipping point now. The inflection point is here. And once we walk off that cliff, it won't take long to reach the hard rock of reality at the bottom. The collapse could come in a few years, or months, maybe even weeks. Once we have divided ourselves to the point that the only adversary we are interested in fighting is ourselves, once we have come to the point where we hate each other more than we hate any of our adversaries, once we have reached the point where the only battle we think worth fighting isn't with Russian or Chinese aggressors, but with the idiot next door, the guy who voted for him, once we no longer take notice of the world, nor challenge our adversaries, nor care about what is going on in the world's hotspots, that is when our enemies will strike. Which will bring us to the second battle we'll have to fight. Because if 1859 was the last time that our nation was so divided, then 1939 was the last time we faced an adversary so committed to removing us from our place as the leader of the free world. A house divided. If you think such talk is crazy, remember that wise men, including more than just Lincoln, have seen this possibility from the very beginning. When asked what sort of government the Constitutional Convention delegates had created, Benjamin Franklin famously quipped, "A republic, if you can keep it." He knew how difficult it would be. He knew the long-term viability of the infant nation was not certain. Indeed, quite the opposite. He knew what they had created chafed against the very nature of man, the nature of societies, the nature and history of every nation that had ever come before. The fall of man into a fallen world had surely proven that. Such a sentiment was more recently expressed by Ronald Reagan, when he said, "We didn't pass freedom to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free." It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that one day we might sit with our children and remind them that we once used to be free. Or, as Reagan said more succinctly, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. The reality is that one generation is all it takes to lose it, and we are in the closing moments of that generation, leaving our nation standing on the edge of a cliff. When we read quotations like this from Reagan, most of us think he was talking about losing our freedom to some foreign threat, and he probably was. But that isn't the greatest threat we face now, or at least it's not the first threat we face. Clearly, the first battle for our survival will be fought from within, the battle lines growing clear. We see the division, the constant talk of civil war, the lack of truth, the hatred far too many Americans feel toward each other, the dividing not into teams but into tribes, entities that seem to exist for assault and division, the silencing of views, shunning, shaming, Ostracizing those who don't think the right way? In the current environment, we're taking our fellow Americans, those who don't think exactly as we do, and reducing them to outcasts. They are imbeciles, evil and selfish and thuggish fools. We want to silence them, fire them, cast them from among us, poison a neighbor's dog because they are on the wrong side of the aisle, make them beg for forgiveness, which will never be granted, and then cast them out. Perhaps Alexei de Tocqueville said it best. Tyranny in democratic republics does not proceed in the same way, however. It ignores the body and goes straight for the soul. The master no longer says, "You will think as I do or die." He says, "You are free not to think as I do. You may keep your life, your property, and everything else, but from this day forth you shall be as a stranger among us. You will retain your civic privileges, but they will be of no use to you. For if you seek the votes of your fellow citizens, they will withhold them. And if you seek only their esteem, they will feign to refuse even that. You will remain among men, but you will forfeit your rights to humanity. When you approach your fellow creatures, they will shun you as one who is impure. And even those who believe in your innocence will abandon you, lest they, too, be shunned in turn. Go in peace. I will not take your life, but the life I leave you with is worse than death. With our woke and cancel culture, that is exactly where we are today. I will not take your life, but the life I leave you with is worse than death. And it should terrify every one of us, because the fight before us goes as deep as our national soul. This isn't about politics or ideas out of D.C. We are well past the time of arguing over policies and economics. Should the corporate tax rate be 21% or 27%? What is the right number of people we will allow to immigrate to this country? Is the government better able to provide health care than the private sector? Such questions, important as they are not the issues that will condemn or save our nation. The questions we are grappling with, the things we actually don't know and we have to figure out, cut to the very core of our nation and the very definition of our future. Is America sustainable? Is it worth defending? Is it good? Is it time to tear it down and start over? What does it mean to be an American? What does our history teach us about ourselves? Clouds on the horizon. We believe there are meaningful landmarks along the road that can tell us where we are headed, warning signs to alert us of what lies ahead. Surely these are a few of the many warning signs around us. Privatization of election process. The 2020 federal election was, to a disconcerting degree, privatized when Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg and other tech titans donated more than $500 million to state election management processes. Amazingly, this is more money than was appropriated by the federal government, $400 million in the CARES Act, to fund the election security during the pandemic. Zuckerberg alone donated nearly $420 million to various nonprofit organizations, with $350 million going to the Safe Elections Project, which essentially created a two-tier election system favoring swing Democratic cities, counties, and states. But it's okay. Nothing to worry about here because, thankfully, Mr. Zuckerberg and other tech giants have assured us they have no political bias, nor particularly any bias against conservatives or former President Trump. Whew, that's a relief. Federal Reserve Bank props. The last few years have normalized what used to be considered fringe in the financial world, tearing the mask from the fallacy that our financial institutions are capable of any introspection regarding the impacts of their actions. No better example exists than the Federal Reserve Bank's frantic effort to prop up the economy beyond any common sense. As an example, for more than 30 years, the Federal Reserve's policy has been to maintain a constant and stable M1 money supply, the primary measure of liquid assets within our economy. After a full generation of stability, 2020 saw
Sample complete. Ready to continue?